It started with a smell, damp, earthy, like wet soil that never quite dries. For Jennifer and her young family, moving into their 1930s fixer-upper was a dream come true. But dreams have a way of turning into nightmares. One weekend, while reorganizing the basement, Jennifer noticed something odd. A small hinged door embedded in the far wall, hidden behind an old shelf. It wasn't on the original floor plan, and she could swear it wasn't there when they first moved in. Curious, she opened it. The door led to a narrow tunnel, pitch black and filled with the kind of silence that presses against your ears. At first it seemed empty, but then faint scratches echoed from deep within. Was it an animal? A raccoon perhaps? But as the days passed, the scratches became more frequent, almost deliberate, and always at the same time, 3:33 a.m. One night, Jennifer's husband decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, he crawled into the tunnel. Minutes ticked by. Then a scream, his scream. When he stumbled back out, his face was pale, his words frantic. It's not a tunnel, it's a staircase, going down. But it doesn't end. Jennifer and her husband, Mark, tried to move on after sealing the door. They avoided the basement entirely, storing their belongings in the garage instead. But avoidance wasn't enough. The scratching continued, now accompanied by faint thuds, like something heavy shifting just beyond the door. At first, they convinced themselves it was the old house settling. But late one night, as Jennifer sat nursing their infant daughter, she heard something new, a low guttural moan rising from below. She froze. The baby stirred in her arms, whimpering softly. Jennifer held her breath, hoping it was her imagination. But then it came again, louder this time, and unmistakable. The next morning, Mark called a contractor to inspect the basement. When the man arrived, he seemed hesitant to even step foot inside. "This house has an energy," he muttered under his breath. But he went down anyway, toolbox in hand. An hour passed, then two. When Jennifer went to check on him, she found his tools scattered on the basement floor. The contractor was gone. She called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He never returned her calls, and she never saw him again. As days turned into weeks, Jennifer noticed her daughter behaving strangely. The baby would stare at the ceiling, giggling at nothing, or burst into inconsolable tears whenever they were near the basement door. One night, Jennifer woke to find the infant's crib empty. Panic-stricken, she searched the house, calling her daughter's name. Then she heard it, a soft cooing sound coming from the basement. Her heart pounded as she approached the sealed door. The scratches were louder now, more frantic. Mark rushed downstairs, grabbing a crowbar. Together they pried the door open, the wood splintering under the force. The tunnel was just as dark and foreboding as before. But there, at the mouth of the passage, sat their daughter, unharmed but staring into the void. Jennifer scooped her up, trembling. "How did she began, but Mark silenced her, his face pale. The scratches had stopped, but a new sound emerged, heavy breathing, deep in the tunnel. Without another word, they fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. The house was put up for sale, but no one stayed for long. One tenant reported hearing voices whispering his name. Another claimed to see shadowy figures darting through the basement. And then there was the old man who lived there alone for nearly a year. He told a neighbor he was making friends with the house, but one morning he was found at the bottom of the basement stairs, clutching a piece of paper. On it he had scrawled a single sentence: "It doesn't want the door closed." Months after the house was abandoned, rumors began to swirl among the locals. Teenagers dared each other to break in, drawn by the house's eerie reputation. Most came back with exaggerated tales of cold drafts and distant creaks, nothing extraordinary. But one group never returned. It was a group of two brothers, Jason and Matt, and their friend Eric. They entered the house late on a cold October night, armed with flashlights and an old camcorder. The plan was simple: film the basement, find the mysterious door, and prove there was nothing to fear. The footage, later recovered by police, tells a different story. Then they head for the basement. The stairs creak under their weight as they descend, their flashlights casting long, flickering shadows on the damp walls. "It's colder down here," one of them whispers. The camera picks up faint noises, scratches, barely audible, but growing louder as they approach the far wall. When they find the small hinged door, Jason shines his flashlight on it. The wood is splintered, as if something or someone had clawed at it from the inside. "This is it," he says, his voice shaking. Eric, holding the camera, steps closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "Should we open it?" Matt hesitates, but Jason grins nervously. "We came this far, right?" The door creaks as it swings open, revealing the narrow tunnel Sarah and Mark had described. The air inside is heavy, suffocating. The scratches on the walls are deeper now, more erratic, as if left by something frantic. Jason crawls in first, the flashlight beam shaking as he moves forward. Matt follows, then Eric, the camera capturing every detail. The tunnel seems endless, and the deeper they go, the stranger the sounds become. First, it's the scratching, then faint whispers, indistinct but undeniably human. The boys freeze, their breath quickening. "Did you hear that?" Jason whispers. The whispers grow louder, more distinct, a single phrase repeated over and over, "Come closer." Jason turns back, his face pale. "Let's go, this isn't funny anymore." But as they begin to retreat, the camera catches something behind them, a shadow impossibly tall standing at the tunnel's entrance. The boys scream, the camera drops, and the screen goes black. The police were called when the boys didn't return home. Their parents, frantic, led officers to the house. The basement door was open, the tunnel exposed, but there was no sign of the boys. The camcorder was found near the tunnel's entrance, its battery drained. When the footage was recovered, investigators were baffled. The final frames showed something impossible, the shadow in the tunnel moving closer, its form shifting and stretching unnaturally. Despite extensive searches, the boys were never found. The case remains open, but the house was condemned shortly after. Locals avoid it completely now, swearing they can still hear faint whispers when they pass by. Whispers that seem to echo a single phrase, "Come closer." The house, its basement, and that door remain a quiet reminder of what lies just beneath the surface. Sometimes what we uncover isn't meant to be understood or escaped. Years passed, and the house on Evergreen Lane became more than just a local legend. It became a forbidden landmark, a place whispered about at bonfires, a dare for thrill seekers who thought they could outsmart the unknown. But the house wasn't done. Decades after the events with Jennifer, her family, and the missing boys, a retired historian named Eleanor Anders moved to the area. Known for her work on documenting forgotten properties, Eleanor became fascinated by the abandoned house. She began digging through old records, trying to piece together its history. What she uncovered was both fascinating and horrifying. The house was built in the 1930s by a man named Harold Greaves, a reclusive architect with a penchant for secrecy. Though the house appeared ordinary, early records showed complaints from builders about strange instructions, underground passageways, hidden compartments, and an elaborate system of tunnels beneath the foundation. But the real horror began after Harold moved in. His wife and young son vanished within a year of its completion. Neighbors reported hearing screams in the night, but no bodies were ever found. Harold claimed they'd left him, though locals never believed him. Then Harold himself disappeared. One day he was there, tending to the yard. The next the house sat empty. For decades it changed hands, each owner staying for less time than the last. A pattern emerged, unexplained noises, missing pets, strange symbols carved into the basement walls. Eleanor found one detail particularly disturbing. In the town's archives, she discovered an interview with a former tenant from the 1960s. The man described a hinged door in the basement, just as Jennifer had. He claimed it was always there, even when I tried to get rid of it. He called it the door that refuses to stay shut. Eleanor couldn't resist. Against the warnings of locals, she contacted a structural engineer and convinced him to explore the house with her. Armed with equipment and lanterns, they ventured into the basement. The hinged door was there just as described. Eleanor, determined to document everything, recorded their every move. When they opened the door, the tunnel loomed before them, cold and foreboding. Eleanor noted something peculiar. The walls were covered in markings, deep grooves that seemed to form a pattern. "It's almost like they're letters," she said, her voice trembling. The grooves looked ancient, far older than the house itself. The engineer, less intrigued and more alarmed, insisted they leave. But Eleanor pressed on, moving deeper into the tunnel. The air grew colder, heavier, their lanterns flickered. And then, without warning, the floor beneath them gave way. Eleanor awoke in total darkness. Her head throbbed, her lantern shattered. She called out, but the only response was the sound of breathing. It wasn't the engineer. This was deeper, guttural, and close. Desperately, she scrambled for her phone, using its faint light to illuminate her surroundings. She was in a vast underground chamber, the walls covered in more of the strange symbols. At the center of the room was a pit, its edges lined with claw marks. And then she saw it. A figure, tall, emaciated, its limbs impossibly long, emerged from the shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, locking onto her. Eleanor froze, paralyzed by its gaze. She doesn't remember what happened next. When she awoke, she was outside the house, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The engineer was never found. Her recordings were corrupted, the footage replaced with static and faint whispers. Eleanor left town shortly after, but her account was enough to reignite fear in the community. The house was fenced off, its basement sealed with concrete. But even now, locals swear the ground around the house feels wrong, colder than the surrounding area, as if something beneath it is still waiting. What lies beneath the house on Evergreen Lane remains a mystery. Was it Harold's twisted designs, something older, buried long before the house was built? Or was it simply a place that shouldn't have been disturbed? Eli worked the night shift at a small convenience store in a sleepy Midwestern town. The job was uneventful until one evening, the power went out. Using a flashlight, he made his way to the basement to check the breaker box. The basement was more of a storage space, cluttered with outdated stock and forgotten items. But there was something Eli had never noticed before, a rusted metal door bolted shut with a chain. Weird, he thought. He'd been working there for months and never seen it. Curious, he asked his manager about it the next day. The manager stiffened, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't touch it. Don't even go near it." Eli laughed it off, but curiosity gnawed at him. A few nights later, during another quiet shift, he went back to the basement. This time the chain was gone. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Summoning his courage, Eli pushed it open. The smell hit him first, pungent and metallic. Then the sound, faint, incoherent whispers. He shone his flashlight into the void, and that's when he saw them. Handprints. Hundreds of them smeared on the walls, as if made by someone or something desperate to escape. Eli quit the next day. When he returned weeks later to pick up his final paycheck, the store had been condemned. No one knows why, but locals avoid the area entirely, claiming they can still hear faint whispers when they walk by. Eli couldn't shake the images from that night. The rusted door, the handprints, the whispers. Even after quitting, he was plagued by nightmares. In them he was back in the basement, flashlight trembling in his hand, staring into that dark void. Only this time the handprints moved, slowly dragging themselves toward him. He convinced himself it was stress, a trick of the mind brought on by lack of sleep and a mundane job. But the nightmares didn't stop, and neither did the whispers. At first he thought they were just in his dreams, but soon he began hearing them during the day, soft, incoherent murmurs, always coming from somewhere just out of sight. A local journalist, Cora Torres, had heard whispers of her own, rumors about the condemned store and the strange events surrounding it. She had a reputation for chasing the town's darkest stories, and this one intrigued her. She tracked down Eli at a nearby diner where he worked. At first he refused to talk, shaking his head vigorously. "I don't want anything to do with that place," he muttered. But Cora was persistent. Finally, after several cups of coffee and her promise to keep his name out of the article, Eli relented. He recounted everything: the power outage, the basement, the rusted door, the handprints. Cora listened intently, jotting down notes. When Eli mentioned the whispers, she paused, her brow furrowing. "Whispers? What did they say?" Eli shook his head. "I couldn't make them. It was like a bunch of people talking all at once. But they were angry." Determined to uncover the truth, Cora began digging into the history of the store. What she found was disturbed. The store had been built in the 1950s, but before that, the land was home to a series of structures: a church that mysteriously burned down, a boarding house where multiple tenants vanished, and even a small jail in the 1800s. All of them shared one thing in common: tragedy. But it was an incident in 1903 that caught her attention. According to old police reports, the site had once been the scene of a mass disappearance. A group of townsfolk gathered to investigate strange noises coming from an underground tunnel. None of them returned. The tunnels were sealed off, and the land was eventually sold. Against Eli's warnings, Cora decided to visit the condemned store. She brought a camera, a flashlight, and a recorder, determined to capture evidence of the whispers. The building was in disrepair, the windows boarded up, and the front door padlocked. She found an open side window and climbed inside, her camera rolling. The store was eerily quiet, the air thick with dust and decay. Cora made her way to the basement, her footsteps echoing on the creaky stairs. She turned on her flashlight, scanning the room. It was exactly as Eli had described: cluttered with forgotten stock, shelves leaning precariously, and at the far end, the rusted metal door. Unlike in Eli's story, the door was shut. Cora hesitated, her heart pounding. She placed her recorder on a nearby shelf and slowly pushed the door open. The smell hit her immediately, stronger than what Eli had described, like rotting metal and damp earth. The whispers began almost instantly, faint but unmistakable. She raised her camera, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The walls were covered in handprints, hundreds of them, some smeared, others perfectly clear. She moved closer, her light catching something on the floor. It was a small pile of objects: a child's shoe, a rusted pocket watch, a tattered piece of cloth. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. Cora froze as a single voice cut through the noise, clear and commanding: "Leave." She spun around, her flashlight darting across the room. There was no one there. The door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. Panic set in. Cora banged on the door, screaming for help, but the whispers drowned her out, growing louder and more frantic. Her flashlight flickered, then died, leaving her in pitch black. Desperately, she fumbled for her recorder, hoping to capture some proof. As she reached for it, something brushed against her arm, cold, wet, and impossibly heavy. She screamed, grabbing the recorder and bolting for the door. When she finally forced it open, the whispers stopped. The air in the basement felt lighter, as if whatever had been there was gone. Cora didn't look back. She ran out of the building, her camera still rolling. Cora's footage and recorder captured more than she expected. The video showed the handprints and the small pile of objects, but it was the audio that sent chills down her spine. The whispers were there, hundreds of voices, overlapping in a chaotic chorus, but when she enhanced the recording, she could hear individual phrases: "Help us, it's still here." And the most shocking of all: "Don't open the door again." Cora never returned to the store. She published her article, leaving out the supernatural elements, and moved on to other stories. But she kept the recorder and the footage, a reminder of the night she ventured too close to something she couldn't explain. Meanwhile, the store remained condemned, its rusted metal door sealed behind a hastily poured concrete barrier. But not far away, life went on. The building's owner, strapped for cash, sold the property to a local contractor who had plans to tear it down and rebuild. The new owner, Paul Henderson, was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything supernatural. To him, the rumors about the store were nothing more than small-town gossip, and he saw the property as an opportunity to turn a profit. Paul began the demolition quietly, hiring a small team to avoid drawing attention. On the first day, the workers cleared out the upper floor, tossing aside rotted shelves and old stock. By the second day, they reached the basement. When they broke through the concrete barrier, sealing the metal door, Paul dismissed the workers' unease as paranoia. "It's just an old basement," he said, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Nothing to be scared of." But as the days went on, things took a turn. Tools went missing, only to be found later in strange, impossible places, like a crowbar balanced perfectly on the edge of a broken shelf. The workers reported hearing faint whispers, which Paul waved off as the wind or the creaking of the old building. Until one night, when Paul decided to stay late to finish the job himself. It was well past midnight when Paul ventured back into the basement, the rusted door now fully open. Armed with a flashlight and a sledgehammer, he planned to finish clearing out the space once and for all. But as he stepped inside, the air changed. It became heavy, oppressive, like stepping into a room with no oxygen. The smell hit him next, pungent and metallic, just as Cora and Eli had described. The whispers began softly, almost indistinct, but grew louder with each step Paul took. He shone his flashlight on the walls, his breath catching when he saw the handprints. They were fresh, as if someone or something had just pressed against the surface. Paul turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him. The whispers became deafening, and his flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Desperately, he swung his sledgehammer at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows around him began to move, separating from the walls and converging in the center of the room. Paul stumbled back, his heart pounding, as a figure began to take shape, tall, emaciated, its limbs impossibly long. The whispers stopped. The figure opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, Paul felt something invade his mind, images of darkness, of countless people trapped in the void, clawing at the walls, begging for release. And then, silence. Paul's workers arrived the next morning to find the basement empty. The metal door was gone, the walls stripped bare, and Paul was nowhere to be found. His truck was still parked outside, his tools scattered across the floor. The property was abandoned once more, but the workers noticed something strange as they left. The air around the building felt colder, and as they passed by the basement stairs, they swore they heard faint whispers, soft, pleading, and unmistakable, "Help us." No one knows what became of Paul Henderson. His disappearance was ruled an accident, and the property was fenced off, deemed unsafe for further construction. But those who live nearby still report strange occurrences. Lights flicker in their homes, objects move without explanation, and on quiet nights, they hear whispers carried on the wind. And then there are the dreams, shared by several locals, of a tall, emaciated figure standing at the foot of their bed, watching, waiting. Whatever was locked beneath that store wasn't just contained, it was waiting. And now, it's free. Years later, the building that once housed the small convenience store refused to be forgotten. Even as time passed, stories continued to trickle out, stories of shadows moving in the corner of one's vision, of strange symbols appearing on nearby sidewalks, and whispers that seemed to follow anyone who dared linger too long near the property. The disappearance of Paul Henderson caught the attention of an experienced paranormal investigator named Daniel Reese. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to jump at ghost stories. He prided himself on debunking the supernatural, exposing hauntings as myths born from hysteria or simple misinterpretations. When Daniel heard about the condemned store, he saw it as an opportunity. If he could investigate the site and disprove the stories, it would solidify his reputation. Armed with recording equipment, infrared cameras, and a healthy dose of skepticism, Daniel set out to confront the legend. His arrival in the small Midwestern town was met with hushed warnings. Locals avoided eye contact, refusing to speak about the store. When Daniel pressed for details, he was met with vague, cryptic responses. You don't want to go there, or whatever's there isn't meant to be found. But Daniel was undeterred. On a crisp autumn evening, Daniel approached the fenced-off property, his camera rolling. He narrated each step of the process, his voice steady and confident. What we have here is a classic case of urban legend, he explained. Fear passed down through generations, fed by coincidence and exaggeration. Tonight we're going to separate fact from fiction. The building was just as the locals had described, boarded up, its windows shattered, and the air around it unnaturally cold. Daniel climbed through the same side window Cora Torres had used years earlier. Inside, the silence was deafening. Daniel set up his equipment in the basement, the centerpiece of his investigation. The rusted metal door was gone, just as the workers had claimed, but the handprints remained faint but visible on the walls. He ran his fingers over them, noting their strange texture. They felt damp, almost sticky, despite the basement being bone dry. This is where the legend begins, he said, into his camera. And if I'm right, where it ends. For hours, nothing happened. Daniel sat in the basement, surrounded by his equipment, reviewing footage and scanning for anomalies. Occasionally, he would hear faint creaks from upstairs, but he dismissed them as the building settling. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the first anomaly occurred. The temperature in the basement plummeted, his thermometer dropping 20 degrees in seconds. His infrared camera began picking up movement, small, faint shapes darting across the screen too fast to be human. And then, the whispers began. Unlike the faint murmurs Cora and Eli had described, these whispers were loud, almost deafening. They came from every direction, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. Daniel's camera captured every second, his wide-eyed face illuminated by the flickering light of his lantern. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent. And then, the door. Though the rusted metal door was gone, a new one began to materialize, shimmering faintly, as if it existed in two places at once. Slowly, it creaked open, revealing an impossibly dark void. Daniel stepped back, his breath quickening. This isn't possible, he whispered, his confidence faltering. From the void emerged a figure, tall, emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by shadows. It moved with an otherworldly grace, its head tilting as if studying him. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic. Daniel's equipment malfunctioned, cameras shut off, recorders played static, and his flashlight flickered uncontrollably. The figure raised an arm, its bony fingers pointing directly at him. A single word echoed in Daniel's mind, clear and disturbing. Leave. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his bag and bolted up the stairs, the whispers chasing him with every step. As he reached the main floor, the building began to shake, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. When he burst through the side window and into the cold night air, the whispers stopped, the shaking ceased. The building was still once more. Daniel reviewed his footage the next day, hoping to make sense of what he'd experienced. Most of it was corrupted, static and glitches obscuring key moments. But one piece stood out, a single frame from his infrared camera, capturing the figure in the basement. Its face was clearer in the image, its hollow eyes staring directly at the camera, its mouth open as if mid-scream. Daniel released his findings online, but the response was mixed. Skeptics dismissed it as a hoax, while believers saw it as proof of the supernatural. For Daniel, it was neither. It was a warning. He never returned to the condemned store, and he gave up paranormal investigations altogether. In interviews, he would only say one thing: some things aren't meant to be understood, and some doors should never be opened.